But these were the very countries where the prosperity reached in the following 30 years to a peak which was not even felt during the period of, let's say, colonial times. For instance, we call 1945 to 1975, 30 years, the golden age of capitalist countries, because the investments made there were such. They were enormous for reconstruction and also expansion of their industries, which provided, particularly after Second World War, countries like India became independent. Their aim is to, let's say, become, let's say, developed. They thought development also meant industrialization. Every investment in terms of capital goods and also other manufactured goods had to be imported from these developed countries. Therefore, there was a vast market from 1945 to, along with that of rebuilding themselves, they're rebuilding their markets, not by now direct colonialism, but by, let's say, trade and investment across the world. But come 1970s, this is the context we are talking in terms of the present. We didn't call 1945 to 1975 or 8 years globalization. There was globalization. India did not ban investments, although it has regulated, let's say, trade. If we look at, let's say, 1975, you find some of the biggest shocks to this prosperity of 30 years of golden age of these highly developed countries, which have built their strengths largely because of investments outside, within their own countries. There was huge, in fact, at that time, countries like India, several countries, not only now, the FDI, they are talking in terms. At that time also we were seeking investments, but nobody was as much interested because they have prosperous prospects of profits within their own countries because their investments were finding markets all across the world. They were very competitive. And this gets a big setback in 1970s when we refer to their own industrial structure, which was built on very cheap base of energy. Then and now, is the energy which drives most of these highly developed economies. In 1975, the situation is oil was available dust cheap. Right from Japan, which never had and which will never have a drop of oil, to that of the whole of Europe and, let's say, the West, built their energy systems largely dependent upon imported crude. And once, I think, the oil crisis comes in, there were two big oil shocks. We know the current situation extends the Israeli situation, the war in West Asia, the emergence of, let's say, much before emergence of OPEC, oil prices, they know their weapon. The prices rise by several fold. The whole of, let's say, the highly developed capitalist countries, production structures become high-cost structures. The energy prices go up, the cost of production increases, the competitiveness comes down, and it is during this 45, 75 countries like India built up. We had our own steel factories, we have our own heavy machinery, several other countries. They were in a position to produce their own capital goods. They were in a position to produce to the extent where high-cost imports were, let's say, uncompetitive. It is this collapse in 1975. There was a crisis of highly prosperous countries, crisis much more severe than what we see of a different kind. 2008 is a different kind in these highly prosperous countries, which has forced them to rethink their interaction with the rest of the world. This is exactly where the President Koshi was raising a question that Nobel laureate Stiglitz was asking, when did and why did it happen? He also answered through that of little Stiglitz, it happened when Reagan became a president. But we must understand that the Reagans, Thatchers, or presidents, wherever they are, in India or let's say any country, or now in the present global world, are instruments of powerful capital And I think it is a powerful finance capital. And therefore, when we say in late 70s, and the beginning of what we call as a Reagan-Thacker combine, heading what we now understand Washington Consensus, that is the beginning of what could be referred to as the globalization. What is this globalization? Since their opportunities for investment in their own countries are not easily available, their own economies have become high cost and non-competitive, therefore their capital must search for cheapest and most profitable avenues of investment. This is how, that means whatever for 30 years we had, what we call as, let's say, controls on our trade. We had a very strong regulated regime. I'm giving an example. We means not necessarily India, most of the developing countries. But this was a big obstacle for your capital, yet free entry. Therefore, what we call as Washington Consensus, popularly known as LPG, originates in this context, that destroy every obstruction for the power of the capital and the goods of these countries. And in fact, you must also know the goods no longer mean goods that we see in terms of physical goods. I think they're all economies now, increasingly service economies. And therefore, there must be avenues for investment of capital as much in services as in perhaps other activities to make profits. And these avenues can come only when you break the barriers to trade and barriers to that of investment. This is the context in which we talk in terms of Washington Consensus trying to promote. In fact, this is also a context where you find institutions like World Bank and that of, let's say, IMF. Some of you perhaps keep on talking and you know that the role played by these agencies. They're used as instruments. You lend resources from these banks or the IMF, and then make those countries to accept opening up of their things, reduce duties. Very interestingly, this is the context of globalization where the one which we are talking now, India, the World so-called Trade Organization, WTO, is born. Because just giving loans to that of World Bank, IMF is not enough to open up. But you must, let's say, have a legal kind of a basis for free flow of, let's say, services and goods, so that they can, let's say, there's also time when you are forced, this is exactly where these countries are so powerful, they're capable of changing your own rules. In fact, one of the best patent laws in the world is supposed to be 1976 Indian patent law, but no, they said all these process patents are dangerous, and then you have product parent, which means that you have to, let's say, make available your markets in goods, services, in banking and other areas. This is the context in which we try to understand globalization, that we have nothing against globalization as a process of interaction, increasing choices, increasing kind of trade between countries. But the terms of this is where we go to that of Vasco da Gama. The terms change. One country dominates. What you had in Arabic or, let's say, East Asia or China trade before Vasco da Gama, it was mutual kind of, let's say, terms. What Vasco da Gama marks is the one-directed kind of a control on other countries, let's say, economies through that of their profits. The same logic continues. And when it comes to the question of the present kind of globalization, it's assertion of the rights of the developed countries to open up the less developed countries, let's say, in areas of investment as well as, say, trade, without, let's say, any protection for them, including the protection that we demand for, let's say, we have to give food for people who are, let's say, supposed to be poor and not capable of buying on their own at market prices. See, this is the kind of a regime. And once, of course, going back to Thatcher and, let's say, Reagan, you see the finance capital trying to do this kind of a powerful system of, let's say, free kind of, let's say, unregulated kind of trade. To begin with, we are now talking about banking. This is exactly where we refer to what happened to their own banking system. In fact, you must have discussed when it came to the question of US banking. We know that bank cannot be treated as like any other economic sector. There are several sectors within an economy, like that of education or health or insurance, particularly insurance in agriculture, and of course banking, which are very sensitive to that of the social kind of, let's say, situation. And if there were to be any mistakes made here, it's not that particular sector which suffers. The whole economy can collapse. That's why when we refer to that of, let's say, the history of banking system, or let's say fair banking or stable banking, we know that there are episodes where the banking system, driven by profit motive, would lead to that of enormous kind of, let's say, crisis, a crisis which will be suffered by the least involved in the crisis. The beneficiaries would get away as they are doing now. But I think when it comes to the question of those who are innocent, investors or non-investors would suffer, right from not only incomes but also in terms of employment. This is exactly what happened. For instance, we talk in terms of, let's say, I know that you are getting restive because it's also getting warm, but that's exactly the kind of a situation I am also talking about. If you go back to that of, let's say, Great Depression in 1930s in US, the whole thing was caused by indiscriminate expansion of what could be called as banking and finance activities, unbridled kind of, let's say, expansion of what could be called stock markets. When it collapsed, what we call as the Great Depression, and when the whole of economy, jobs lost, the kind of production loss, the whole country is experiencing negative kind of a growth, in a sense, decline in the whole economy. It was in this context that United States himself brought about in 1933 an act called as Glass-Steagall Act. This was an act which tried to regulate, control banking system, which is likely to affect everyone, to be within the limits. And this is where we draw between what could be called as socially responsible banking, and I also say that what may be referred to irresponsible banking, where I think you try to make profits by all means, particularly through that of securitization, etc. The Glass-Steagall Act in 1933 insisted and put that as a law, that banks have a primary role for the society, therefore their activity should be confined to that of mobilization of deposits at reasonable rates of interest to that of, let's say, depositors. It can invest in government securities, invest in, let's say, at a fair rates, again regulated on, let's say, other investors, for lend to other investors. I mean, this meant, the Glass-Steagall Act meant that once you start, let's say, regulating the banks' lending to that of, let's say, productive purposes, the leverage for what could be called as unlimited financialization, securitization stops. This is how you can maintain a balance, but there is an interesting kind of a problem, because banks cannot make profits as they like in other sectors. That's a major difficulty. It is this, I think, on this regulated system, you superimpose what we are referring to as the regime of, let's say, globalization, where everyone is looking for investment opportunities all over the globe and then making enormous profits in the process through that of trade. And if the banks were to compete with them, they had to look for some other kind of opportunities, because the only way is violate. And in fact, it is the Reagan regime in 1982 which has started relaxing banks to, let's say, start their subsidies for underwriting securitization. And in the process, what happens, if you look at, let's say, the banking failures in the United States, as long as the Glass-Steagall Act was intact from 1933 to that of, let's say, 1981. That is the beginning of globalization. The bank failures were minimized. I mean, in fact, in 1930s under Great Depression, as many as 5,000 banks collapsed. But if you look at, let's say, the contribution made by this regulation, there was hardly any kind of collapse of the banks. The annual rate of collapse of banks between 1936 and that of 1981 was just 1 for 1 year. But after the introduction of these Reagan reforms, trying to suggest banks can enter into that of, let's say, additional financialization through that of the subsidiaries, you find between 1981 and then, let's say, 2000, the annual failure of banks increased to that of, let's say, 131 banks failing every year. This is a big signal for the United States. Something is going wrong in the finance sector. And the way in which perhaps they're trying to make money failing is happening. But the administration in US, in the euphoria of globalization, was not trying to rein in the banks to, let's say, behave and reduce financialization. This is exactly where you go from 2004 onwards. That is the peak, what we call as, let's say, the subprime kind of a thing. Indiscriminate kind of expansion. You give a loan, securitize it, sell it across, not only in the US, to all other places for a discount, that's more a price. In the process where you expand, let's say, the banking kind of, let's say, profits, and in fact the incentives are also, every chief executive of the bank was awarded additional bonuses linked with that of, let's say, this expansion. And if you look at the kind of, let's say, remuneration that the bank's chief executives were getting, for instance, it shows that an average bank chief executive's earnings in 1981, at the beginning of this globalization or so-called deregulation in the United States, was something like 1:100 compared to that of an ordinary household income. But by the time it is, let's say, the beginning of the crisis in 2007, it increases 1:500. That means enormous incomes are as incentives given to that of, let's say, chief executives. So therefore, if you leave the regulation, whatever the executive does is rewarded as, let's say, his achievement, which is, I think, completely contradictory. And in fact, they are so powerful that they are posing themselves as too big to fail. Therefore, the so-called self-regulation that has come to that of banking sector has literally led to that of, let's say, destruction of the confidence and trust of the people, for the collapse which we talk in terms of 2008 as, let's say, great meltdown of the financial system. But the United States did not stop there. It will not stop even now. It has pushed most of the European banks. If you, for instance, look at Europe is known for predominantly strong, at least was known for strong public sector banking. In fact, if you look at, let's say, major countries like Italy, France, and that of Germany, until this 1980s, they were predominantly public sector banks. And in fact, if you refer to that of, for instance, a country like that of France, by 1980s, up to 1987, you would find that public sector banks, it started, let's say, from 1987, privatizing. By 1999, within a matter of 10, 12 years, only a small minority were left in the public sector as banks. And the worst happened in the case of Italy. Even in 1992, most of the banks in Italy were public sector banks. But the pressure was so much that they started, let's say, privatizing, and within a short time, less than 10 years, by 1991, the public sector deposit holdings reduced from almost 60% to that of 10% in Italy. And Germany still has strong public sector presence, but I think if you look at the deposits, Even there, the public sector deposit holdings have come down substantially from 50% in 1970 to that of 25%. I tell this story because the so-called subprime crisis and then the banking crisis did not happen because of, let's say, simple management failures or, let's say, lack of, but this failed because there is a systematic attack on what could be called as, let's say, the regulated kind of banking. And the regulated kind of banking automatically meant public sector banking. Of course, there is a contradiction because the United States never had as much presence of public sector banks, but the controls saved them. But in the case of other countries, is the conversion of public into that of private banks and that of, let's say, the also decline of regulation that is meant. I mean, in fact, when it comes to, that's why I think we talk of banking sector as a delicate sector, because if something happens in the banking sector, what happened in subprime is none of the big, including the banks and the executives, were affected, because I think the president has mentioned that Obama administration infused what they call as, this is called as quantitative expansion, pumping in money into that of economy and also into the banks which were failing. They didn't want them to fail. First City National Bank is a symbol of United States and you will not allow it to fail. And therefore you pump in the kind of money is equivalent to $1 trillion into the banks and to that of the economy. Can any country like India, if there were to be such a crisis, think in terms of doing any such thing? Every country, either in Europe or all developed countries, did the same kind of a thing. In crisis, they wanted to protect. And therefore, when it comes to the question of, let's say, the crisis, the banks did not suffer. The executives in bank did not suffer. The fellows who were closed down, that's it, hundreds of banks which are closed down, their employees suffered. The larger public, in fact, there's a merciless kind of a suffering of the ordinary people who wanted to buy a house, and then the kind of, let's say, activities and the decline in employment. Even now, you are not able to come back to that of the previous position. And this kind of a disaster can happen. And then when it comes to the question of, let's say, banking sector, since if it is not fair, if it fails, unlike, let's say, an automobile company failing, it affects the company and then maybe the employees in that. If the bank fails, the whole economy fails, gets a setback which perhaps is very difficult to recover from. These are the lessons which are available. But in spite of that, what is that we are doing in India? I mean, see, in fact, when it comes to the question of our own public sector, day in and day out, there is an attack on banking sector, particularly public sector being a predominant part of, let's say, banking sector. In fact, if you look at with all this crisis, as recently as in 2011, the Organization for Economic Development, what we call as OECD, it's a club of richest 24 or 27 countries now. This country, the report of the OECD shows that India is a country of most inefficient banking. Why? I quote this. I quote from this OECD. They are very powerful. They would like to change the whole of, let's say, the world to suit their requirements. That's the kind of a situation where our own